I want to talk about India's energy needs of the near future. So, according to a Reuters article, India's government has announced that it probably will increase its coal fired power generation capacity by over 22% over the next 3 years. So, that this is until end of 2021. And so, even though India's power demand recently decreased by more than 3%, which is because of a lackluster economy, the government predicts significant demand growth in the near future, and the International Energy Agency also sees India to become the second largest coal consumer after China in the early 2020s. And I find this very plausible, of course, if you just think about the potential on the paper that India has. So India has about 1.3 billion humans, just a few less than China right now, and it probably will overtake China in the population growth area. So there are, as many Indians as Chinese about, and then they only have half of the CO2 emissions of the American economy, whereas China has double the amount of CO2 emissions annually as the American economy has. So India is on many levels far poorer than China, but definitely far, far poorer than America. And so this also means that there are literally hundreds of millions of Indians and also Chinese waiting to get to the level of prosperity that you and I enjoy, Don. So there's a huge potential for energy demand growth in India, and over the short term and over the long term as well. And I think this is really illustrative of the fact that the future emissions of CO2, from coal-fired capacity or anything else, traffic, oil-derived fuels, and so on, most of the future emissions will come from other countries than the United States or Europe. So, hundreds of millions of people, as I mentioned, in India alone, and they will probably grow over the next few years by a lot more than developed economies. You know, given the right policies, of course, that's always a big caveat. But this also puts into perspective something like the Green New Deal for America. So even all the Democratic presidential candidates that have either endorsed the Green New Deal or put something similar online as their energy program for America, they don't have remotely a plan for things like India's increasing energy demand. They have no alternative. They're saying, oh, renewables, renewables. But as we see, India chooses coal-fired capacity over the next years. So even if American domestic policies would be very successful in reducing CO2 emissions, there's no global plan from any of these candidates that I've seen. So they are making some arguments about, a border adjustment tax, but that doesn't help with domestic energy consumption in India or China. And so this is going to add a lot more capacity in the future. And it begs the question, like, what are these candidates and the advocates who say, okay, we need to drastically reduce CO2 emissions doing internationally? Because there's a global CO2 budget. And if you think that CO2 must be limited, then you have to engage with it on a global level. There's no use in crippling the American economy, for example, and then having India and China just, doubling their CO2 emissions in this. So I think this is a particular failure by most politicians that talk a lot about, domestic programs of energy efficiency and, killing the coal industry and so on. And they don't even remotely recognize the dimension of the energy supply problem and what they are actually proposing in terms of CO2 emission limitations, because this is an international thing. This is an international challenge if you want to limit CO2 emissions. Of course, I don't think the Indians should do that, because whatever the climate will be in 2050 or 2100, I don't think it will be remotely as devastating as if the Indian economy stays on its current level, with most rural Indians being very, very poor. and they not having remotely the energy and technology at their disposal to deal with any kind of weather or climate related issue. But it really boggles the mind to think about, like, China is already emitting twice the amount of CO2 as America, and it's still growing in that. And India hasn't even gotten to the place where China is right now and is still growing in population and the economy.
Yeah, I definitely agree with all that. I want to stress a different part of this whole discussion, which is that like this should be good news, right? Like people should hear about what's going on in India and China and their kind of rapid adoption of energy and all of the wealth and prosperity that follows from that. This should be completely exciting. Like imagine, and yet people are not excited about it. They only talk about it in this kind of context where it's, oh man, what are we going to do that these other countries are increasing their CO2? Like, imagine you have a poor neighbor and you see him kind of work his way out from nothing and become like, the next Jeff Bezos. And all you're thinking is, oh my gosh, he had such lower carbon footprint back when he was poor. What are we going to do now? Like, there are certain ideas or conclusions that are a good indication that you've gone off track in your thinking, even if you can't spot the exact error. Like, just to take an extreme example, although I'm not equating these things, like if you end up with an argument that says, oh, Hitler and Stalin were, they were on the right track, like, you've gone horribly, horribly wrong in your reasoning. And I think there's a similar thing here. Like, if you view the increasing energy and prosperity of India and China as a negative, then like you've really gone off the rails. Like one of the reasons we've praised Bill Gates in this show is because even though we think he's too worried about the impact of CO2, he has that view of like prosperity is a good thing, and any solution has to lower CO2 in a way that's consistent with people, especially poor people, having energy and prosperity. And I mean, the reason that we've gone off the whole track is that the ideal of people, their whole orientation is not human flourishing, but non impact. And so, if that's the way that you're seeing the world, then, if you see a billion Indians are getting wealthier and using more energy, all you see is the impact, not the benefits, because you don't regard them as benefits. You regard them as like, this is more of harming the earth and ruining the climate.